let's talk about the role of Subsea, and let's use an example of why it's critical to the world and also essential to Australia. This small cable has had the biggest impact on undersea cable and on regulatory policy than any cable in the last 20 years. Guam, Saipan. Anybody heard of it? I didn't think so. What happened when it got cut? Well, that's the actual diver, by the way, repairing the cable, had a shunt fault. But when it got cut, all the services went down. There was only one cable between Guam and Saipan. And when all the services go down, here's what happens. Commercial impact, no airports, no cash, no checks, no transactions. This happened on a Thursday night. People went to the bank, they went to take out some money, take their family out to dinner. The ATM machines didn't work. Next day, they went in, tried to wire money from family members elsewhere, no way to access the wire. And of course, no Facebook, right? No social networks. That's a real travesty. Government, no immigration, no services, no social services, no emergency services, no communication. And specifically with services, there are no emergency services that are available and no cell phone service. So no access to the outside world. If we looked at this in a microcosm, you'd see what a disaster it is not to have that sort of connectivity. This is the real disaster. No Game of Thrones that night on Thursday. That's when the congressmen were getting all the phone calls saying, I want my cable back up. But unfortunately, it took about 15 days to get a ship there, and the ship comes out and they find where the cables needs to be spliced. They pull it up on the ship and splice it and put it back together and then run traffic over it. But after that, our government, the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission, now, because of this, we have to do all this reporting on cables that get taken out of service. So if you don't have a cable connected, or you only have one, you don't have the diversity of 3 or 5 or 7 or 8, then it means tremendously big problems. Okay, Australia is exceptionally well positioned for growth. 176 terabits of connectivity, international connectivity, have come or are coming to Australia in the next year and a half. Some of these have already landed. We'll talk about a few. But these are all numbers you've seen before. Everything's growing, 50% year-over-year growth in terms of demand. So you've seen all these numbers, but they only get bigger, and there aren't enough cables to service the current demand. When you look at the investment, what I'll call the large content providers of the OTTs, they've made over $200 billion of investment thus far. And the investments aren't just to put up data centers, the investments are to protect their assets. Now, last I checked, every byte, every international call, every internet search that leaves Australia goes to the west coast of the US first and then comes back. And the other 50% go to, or much of it anyway, go to Asia, somewhere in Asia. So that's where the connectivity needs to be. And in terms of getting cables built, we'll talk about the complexity of getting cables built, but they're getting harder and harder. Maybe 2 cables a year get built, maybe. And that's for all of Asia, Pacific, and Australia. Globally, maybe 3. If it's a good year, 4. And then every possible disaster along the way that you can imagine happens. Okay, Australia, fastest growing data center. This is a bit misleading, but it's a nice stat that puts Australia at the top. It's ranked by the watts per capita of the data centers globally, but it still is important. It's important to see that Australia is essential. And I will tell you that Australia is essential for storing data because of 3 things. Rule of law, somewhat, I don't want to say cheap real estate, but somewhat less expensive real estate than other places, and proximity, geographic proximity to Asia. So many data centers coming in Australia, and there's a reason for that. And the primary reason is the OTTs, the large content providers, they're having some problems accessing their data centers in places like Taiwan, Indonesia. Those are places where rule of law is a little bit more challenging. To get the data center built, then trying to get access to it can sometimes be complicated. Bandwidth is essential to prevent cyber attacks, we all know that, but what you may not know is that the big companies, the tier 1s, even the tier 2s, and also the OTTs, large content providers, they usually have up to 7 to 9 physically diverse paths for bandwidth. However, they have 3 or 4 out of Australia, and that's important, but they're limited to the number of cables that exit.